Great to be here. And Adam, we wondered if you might start with a reading from the book.
Well, I thought I might read a bit about the time. This is a book about some rock pools on the west coast of Scotland. And this is about how it felt actually to make, you call them tide pools, we call them rock pools. So the way in which I thought that I was going to make a tiny little bit of shore, which I could get to know in a completely intimate way, because the ocean is too large to know. But the shore has a way of playing with those expectations, that you might think that smallness is its currency, but in fact it turns out to be the very opposite. The shore is filled with infinite regressions, from ocean to channel to bay to pool, to bay within the pool, to an inlet in that bay, to a micro pool, an inlet within it, and so on and on into the microscopic. The whole sequence is a frozen, or in fact exceptionally slow, kind of fractal turbulence, the sea imposing on the land a form of shaping, which, if taken away from our own time perspective and given its planetary due, would bubble and break in time as well as in space, an endless overturning of the substance of the world. To make a rock pool was in fact to make something no less complex than the ocean itself. But here is the dizzying part. Fractal theory suggests that the closer you look at something, the more it remains unknown. Knowledge cannot embrace whatever it seeks to know. It can only sit alongside the world, contingent with it, touching it maybe at one or two points, but shrinking beside the unaddressable and limitless actuality of things. The rock pool was not going to be a tiny, graspable fragment of the universe. It was going to be as unknowable as the universe itself. This is one of the oldest of conundrums. Plato knew it. Socrates asked in his usual taunting way, "May a man not possess and yet not have knowledge?" The question was not whether a man may have the knowledge, which is obvious enough, we all know things, but whether the knowledge can have the thing it knows. The habitual Socratic interrogative is a fractal form, doing no more than revealing the questions within his questions, as if the world were a series of Chinese boxes, each one labeled uncertainty. Suppose someone has caught some wild birds, Socrates asked, doves or any other birds, and is keeping them in an aviary which he has made at home. We can say of him in one sense that he has them, because he possesses them, might we not? And yet, in another sense, he has none of them. It's the most subversive picture of knowledge. Look at a wild creature, even hold it in your hand, and it's obvious that you do not have it. You hold it, but everything it is stretches far beyond your enclosing fingers in time and space and through its own interior existence. You may possess it, even for a moment, but it is not yours. Plato's understanding was to see knowledge in the same way. Whatever it is that is to be known remains outside the grip of our knowing it. The knowledge can scarcely embrace the irredeemably wild and unconstrained facts it hopes to know. We might make an aviary of our ideas, but the birds we shut inside it have their life and being far beyond its walls. When I first heard the story of Socrates' aviary, which is the nub of Socratic wisdom, the acknowledgement that fractal depths lie within any known or measured surface, I whooped with the pleasure of recognition. It confirmed everything I'd been instinctively feeling about the pool. What is a tidal pool but a cage, an aviary with permeable walls? A volunteer zoo into which life will come if the conditions are congenial, but leave when the tide floods and the walls become irrelevant. Not a place that preserves what is already there, but a frame to encourage the assembling of life, in whose linkages and interstices the functions of life might find a home. Nothing in it would be mine. Its boundaries would be both open and closed, alternating with the tides twice a day, breathing like that, drawing organisms in, holding them, releasing them, depending on the sea to give it life. Making the pool was a kind of gardening, but one in which the gardener merely built the enclosure or half enclosure, an enclosure that twice a day melted and dissolved, only to reappear as the tide dropped and brought no plants and weeded no weeds. It represented a curiously true relationship to the natural. Making it would be a human act, but with a natural outcome. It could both enclose and fail to enclose. Its fractal spirals could spin off into the sea itself. It would be a model of Socrates' aviary, and in that inadequacy, the explicit transience of its containment would be a kind of perfection, perfect because imperfect. I like reading that out.
Thank you. It's really really lovely, and I think also a beautiful distillation of the project of the book, and that, you know, it's one of the things I love most about this book is how, for lack of a better term, uncategorizable it is.
Yeah.
You know, you have this, it begins with this almost comic heroic effort to build a rock, you know, forge a rock pool. We have axes. I mean, it's a real physical activity, and imagining you getting down into the muck and the seaweed and fashioning this tide pool is its own sort of adventure. And then, but it's also, you know, the book is a work of natural history. It's a work of history and regional history. It's a work of there's philosophical strains that run through it. And I wondered how you thought of it, and how, you know, it's sort of maybe it's a boring way to start, but how do you characterize it? I suppose, you know, if pressed, I would say it's a work of natural history, but that seems very incomplete. I wondered if there was a tradition that you saw yourself being part of with this book.
Well, I think to be honest, I think the book, for a lot of the time I was writing it, felt like I had to resolve its muddle, that it wanted to be about so many contradictory and sort of unconformable things that it was a strain to in the writing of it to get it to work. I mean, I'm sure a lot of writers know this sensation that I often think about when writing a book, that actually the ingredients of the book are this large sort of anarchic cloud, which you have to somehow contain and hold. It's a lot of I think people might think of writing as you have to sort of somehow get it, and the difficult thing is getting it. Actually, my experience of it is there's always too much of it, and it is just sort of roaring and in your head, and it's to make it calm. And the final thing is a book, you know, an actual physical book, and even the way it looks on a page is so ordered, and the relationship between that otherness and the book is the job of the writer. And so I think in the end this book is about how wrong it is to categorize things in exclusive categories, oddly enough. That actually, if you are going to talk about natural history, and there's a lot about the way in which animals live in this book, you should also understand people as another animal in that context, an extraordinarily powerful animal presence in that. And that, in fact, human history and human social arrangements and the whole sort of anthropological idea of the human is itself really not very unlike the way in which we understand that animals arrange their lives. And so it is all about transitions between categories, so that you do, and a transition between scales, and that's that thing about the kind of the fractal being at the core of it, that you look at the tiny and you see the universal. And you understand that as the tide comes in, the tide coming in is actually the spinning of the earth within the sea. And there's a why is the earth spinning within the sea? Because whatever it is, 6 billion years ago, the solar system formed. And so as the tide seeps into your tide pool, that is the universe actually happening. So I mean, and so that is I think what the book truly abstracted is about.
Well, there is a real, sorry, go on.
Go on. I meant
there is a real harmony.
So abstractly as that. So every element of that relationship is made as concrete as I can in it, which is one of the reasons actually to build the things, is that you are involved with the very physical, and even with the kind of this kind of sweat and exhaustion of doing it is somehow relevant to that, about not being a kind of disengaged voyeur, but actually being another animal, physical animal there. I never know if any of these things make sense to talk like that.
Absolutely. And there's a harmony, I think, between the style of the book and the subject of the book. As you said, it's about this, there's a great line, nothing is stable and yet everything coheres is a line in the novel, in the book that I underline. And that for me spoke to the whole project. And it's the form of the book, it never feels unruly, but you're able to move from these very specific, concrete, physical actions to the highest planes of Western thought and back. There's a telescopic effect that I thought was really beautiful. And I'm glad that your point about the specificity of it, I think, is for a project like this to succeed as it does, you do need deep specificity. And one of my favorite things about the book, and this perhaps I associate this with a strain of maybe British naturalism, but maybe that's misplaced, but the extreme specificity about place, terminology. I learned more words in this book than I have in many years in any book. Names of species, names of natural phenomena, and of course, it's, very specific regional names. And I wonder if there's something about the UK, about this ancient land that's been populated for so long with so many stories, and does it give itself more to a deeper mapping of place?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure that actually Scotland or the rest of Britain is no older in the kind of engagement with its life and its landscapes is no older than anywhere else, but it maybe does have a continuity there, and so that a lot is extraordinary amounts unknown. And I think one of the things that modern English and Scottish writers are anxious about are not being imperialistic about this, about not swinging into somewhere and not giving it its due and its credit, that actually the place itself needs to speak, because my God, it'll be absolutely drenched in meaning. And one of the tasks is to draw that meaning out and to give it its due. There's a lot of anxiety about that now, because the older tradition of travel writing is obviously to turn up and be the giant ego, to be the kind of marvelously impressive experiencing self. And that seems completely illegitimate now, that it's a kind of terrible imposition or whatever it is you're trying to make live on the page. I mean, I think that is a really central function to me, to make the thing actually vivid on the page as it would be for anyone who was there. And you can do that if you are a sort of empire building, khaki shorts, TP, whatever it's called, imperialist. But my idea is not that. And I think a lot of people think that now. It's how thrilling to actually make the world speak. I think that is the verve here. That's that if it's an animal, or even the workings of the tide, or the meanings in the rocks, or anything that actually is, to get it to be literally the medium through which it speaks, is completely wonderful feeling of engagement, and a sort of almost like a kind of useful servant to it, is how I think of it.
There are animal characters in the book as well as human characters, and I wanted to begin with some of the people that you write about, because they're some of the names I wrote down were John Von Thompson, Philip Henry Goss. Is that am I
Goss,
pronouncing it
yeah,
correctly?
Goss, yeah.
He looms particularly large over the narrative. Your own father-in-law, John Raven. There are these beautiful little portraits of individuals, naturalists, and particularly. And I wondered, for you, which were there any that you felt in a special kinship, or that loomed particularly large in your own as you moved through this world?
Well, I mean, I early on, I mean, I say in the book that I hope it's not too gross a pun, that if you spend a long time with these pools, they're very reflective places, and you start, there's a lot of time to think. And so I thought, my first thought was a kind of rather crazy fictive thing to do. So it wouldn't be great, if I could actually get Socrates down there in his sort of ragged wind cheater and his sort of hopeless torn waterproof trousers, and just that is part of this no boundary thing, that somehow people think, you should only really be reading Plato in the library or something. But actually, to have Plato, or Heidegger was an incredibly revelatory person, who my daughter's boyfriend's sort of brilliant 30-something architect. He said, well, you can't do this without reading Heidegger. So I read Heidegger. So Heidegger spent a month with me, and Darwin spent a month with me. And as you say, my father-in-law, who's long dead, I never actually met him, but he was a Cambridge professor of classics philosophy, and he had written about the pre-Socratics and about Heraclitus, and Heraclitus becomes an incredibly large figure. And so there are a whole series of these unreal people turning up with me, and almost conversing about what is life, what is it to be alive, what is our relationship with things as they are, how can we know what things as they are. And so all of those extremely large philosophical questions seem absolutely as natural as seaweed in these places to me. That's what the book is about too, really.
I mean, you make the case. I feel like you make a case for every book should just begin and end in a tide pool and go out from the universe of the tide pool.
It's great fun making them. I can recommend it as a process. I mean, it's really fun because it's quite slightly like cake making with the concrete and everything, and then to see what happens, to see what comes. Somebody said to me halfway through when I was doing this, said, well, it's just an act of bioreceptivity. And so I thought, yes, that's exactly right. You are just making this naked place. It's like the planet before life exists. It's just a sort of raw rock place. And the sea delivers its multiplicities to you. And it's just really enlarging that. Yeah, I felt very excited for months at a time doing this.
Well, and it's appropriate, I think, that to do this event at Point Reyes, because my first experience with the tide pool culture was writing a story once. It was a little south in Santa Cruz, where you have these beautiful rocky shores, and it was I learned it was a huge, a major activity for young people all along the coast to tide pool and look for sea stars. And I was writing a story about how the sea stars were all committing suicide in a mysterious fashion along the coast. But it did
Yes,
put
I
me in
read that
touch
story of yours. Yeah.
with this culture of, the tide pools came to seem like the natural entry point for young people, not only in their first encounters with the ocean, but really their first encounters with the natural world, for lack of a better term. And
Yes,
so,
I mean, I slightly, I think in a rather kind of grumpy old man way, I slightly resent that idea that it's a
tell me why.
that it's a children's place. Why should it be a children's place? Because when you grow up, then you go off and you go chasing tigers in India or something. But because as I said, the whole notion of the pool is that it's as large as anything you want to know, and it has in it love and hate and suffering and triumph and dominance and grief and failure and catastrophe and so on, invasion. Even in this day we could say that word. And so actually I think there is I mean, I don't mean to be horrible to you, Nathaniel, but it's patronizing
no, I like
to say that about the pool.
No, I think you're right. I mean, and
they're huge adult things. Yeah.
well, in the story that I was reporting, the children would run from the tide pools screaming in horror because they'd see these sea stars tearing their own arms off. And you write about the species actually in the book, the ochre, predominantly the ochre sea stars.
Yes.
I was reminded reading that, this point has been made by Joy Williams, the novelist, and also Amitav Ghosh, that literature is too human centric, human obsessed. And in this new age that we're in, where we've lost, sense of losing reverence for non-human beings, that what literature needs is animal, non-human centric work. And I have some skepticism about that idea, particularly when it comes to the novel, which is what Joy Williams is referring to. But it did strike me reading this book that you actually have these intense dramas about, the love life of crabs, for instance, and other, often microscopic species in these tide pools that have all the drama of any human affair. And I wondered what you made of that whole idea, and how challenging is it to write about non-human animals, and what are the pitfalls and challenges of doing so?
Yes, well, I mean, the pitfall that everybody comes to straight away is the anthropomorphic thing, that you're imputing to animals feelings, say, or thoughts that only belong to human beings, and that there is a real anxiety in the old scientific community, much less now, I think, about understanding that what an animal might feel something. But I think modern science, it has moved beyond that, and I described as a very good, incredibly sort of emblematic experiment done by a Frenchman in Bordeaux, Pascal Fossin, a young researcher in the university there. And he caught some crayfish in the marshes near there, which aren't sea rock pools, but they have the same nervous system as the prawns I was talking about. And he divided his crayfish that he caught into 3 batches, and kept them very calm and happy in aquariums for a month or so before starting to do his experiment. And one batch he just left calm and happy, and he put them into a maze, an underwater maze, which had some light arms and some dark arms. And these completely contented crayfish just explored the whole maze. They would go wherever they wanted, into the light, into the dark, because they're very curious creatures wanting to know what was going on there. And then the second batch, he gave them a mild electric shock. You know how cruel scientists are. And after they had had the mild electric shock, he then put that second group into the maze. And these ones that had been shocked but weren't being shocked at the time were very reluctant to explore the maze at all. They stayed in the safe, dark arms of the maze and wouldn't go into any of the well-lit areas. And then the third group, he gave the mild electric shock to, and then injected them with benzodiazepine, which is an anti-anxiety drug used for people. And the crayfish that had been shocked and given the drug behaved exactly like the crayfish that were completely content anyway. So he says, he then very rarely for a scientist speculates on what this means. And what it means is that the crayfish that had had the shock and no drug were anxious. They were worried about what might happen to them. And so the crayfish not only had a sense of the past, they knew what had happened to them, they also had a sense of the future. They could imagine what might happen to them. They could actually dream or feel fear of something that wasn't there. And then obviously with the anti-anxiety drug, then they were relieved. And so these are animals that have 700 million years of separation in evolution from us. But it means that they have a mental life, which is actually susceptible to the same drug therapies as we are. They have actually an understanding of time, threat, anxiety, desire to do things which they don't dare do, probably a kind of an urge to act and a reluctance to act, and actually an extraordinarily complex mental cosmos there. And so, you know, and these are crayfish or prawns. And so what do you think when you hear that? Do you think, can you really draw a kind of absolutely firm line between human beings, or maybe the higher primates or something, who feel things, and these other crustacea who don't feel? You can't draw that line anymore. And so this is in a way also about boundary crossing. Don't categorize. To categorize is to fail, I think, actually. And a lot of, you know, the grand crisis of biodiversity that we all know about now is largely a product of drawing that line, of not imagining that prawns have an imagination. I do eat prawn sandwiches, I have to admit. And I can only say that I thought about this. Why am I happy to eat a prawn sandwich? Because if I were in a sandwich and a prawn saw me, it would certainly eat me. So that is perfect. Right. That is satisfactorily reciprocal, you know, like that.
Yeah, it goes both ways. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. I mean, no, and I'm reminded there's a great passage about, I think it's the sea anemones, where you talk about these chemical impulses in the water.
Yes.
And how, and you're making this point, I think, that what's to distinguish, we use the same neural pathways in our cognitive processes.
Yeah.
As these
and a sea anemone has no central nervous system, no brain, no eye, no ear, no gut, no skin. I mean, it's an incredibly primitive animal. And like you wrote a marvelous thing about the immortal jellyfish, didn't you? The jellyfish that never die. Well, sea anemones never die, because if you cut one in half, each half becomes another sea anemone. And when it generates a polyp, a little clone of itself, that is itself the same self exists in many bodies among anemones. And these things, which are so primitive in the way of animals, nevertheless can know who its clone brothers, or not sex, no, these clone equals are, can detect an enemy, can kill an enemy, can even decide that an enemy, it's a very difficult thing to say this, an enemy is an enemy is stronger than it, and can decide not to fight it because it seems to be a kind of bigger, tougher anemone, and it would come off worse. So the mystery of consciousness is something I think we can't be kind of casually dismissive of like that. It remains profoundly unknowable to me. I like that too. We live in a peopled world,
Yeah, that's our new. That's the name of our rock band, the Enemy Anemone.
Yeah, quite.
Like our punk, side project. I want to remind people out there, now's a good time to start entering your questions. I guess. Oh, I see. Maybe some people have already. I would be neglectful to let the conversation go without you talking about your Plankton shot of vodka. I think we needed a little primer on that, and I had a few more questions that weren't answered in the book. But perhaps you could.
When I was late in the summer, when the kind of plankton bloom is kind of thick in the sea off the west coast of Scotland, and all the shore crabs have generated their larval stages, and the sort of marvelous kind of thickness in the sea. Sometimes you can even see it in the kind of, I don't know if this is true in the Pacific, but a kind of slow slurping of the sea. The sea actually starts to become even viscous with the plankton. And so I caught a load of plankton in a plankton net, just slowly trawling it up and down in the bay off the house that I have there. And I didn't have any sort of industrial alcohol to stop these things zizzing about in the petri dish in the microscope. And so the only thing I had was a little bit of Finnish vodka, and so I poured the plankton into the Finnish vodka and saw these wonderful. Have you ever done this? Looked at plankton through a microscope? Have you done that, Nathaniel?
I feel like I've seen video, but I've never myself.
No. It's thrilling. These tiny things, they look like tiny sort of parts of engines, which are literally smaller than the full stop on a printed page, and yet have all the complexity of life in. Anyway, so I spent a marvelous afternoon gazing at these crab megalopses and all that, kind of the larval stages, and with the fumes of the vodka wafting up around me. And I thought the only thing I could do at the end really is to show them some honor, was to drink the vodka, which had that little proteinaceous, minimal proteinaceous addition to it. I don't know whether I could have been poisoned by some horrific sort of, I don't know, terrible form of plankton. But anyway, a plankton shot. I can recommend it. More for the looking than the drinking, probably. Have you got a microscope? Have you got a microscope?
No.
A microscope is one of the great things in life, I think.
I have a telescope, but it doesn't really work ever. So I'm always.
Me too. Yeah.
There's also a remarkable thing in about land. I mean, one thing that strikes me is not only are you moving in this book from, the scale of creatures, from, human beings to plankton, but there's remarkably fluid use of time and chronology, and that you're able to move from very, microscopic time signatures to the history of the world. And there's this beautiful discussion of land rot, the postglacial rebound, which is something that I am somewhat embarrassed to say I had not read about, for all my reading about sea level rise, but this idea that the ice, well, I should let you describe it, but how the planet is also, as the seas are rising, so is the land.
Yes, I mean the weight of ice in the Ice Age ended, whatever it was, 10,000 years ago in Northern Europe, was so heavy that it actually pressed down on the tectonic plates, and so the melting of the ice means that the land very slowly bounces back up, the postglacial rebound, or isostatic uplift, they call it. And so there is a very, very complicated thing which no one has actually quite worked out in the British Isles, that the land floats up, but of course, as the ice melts, the sea level rises as well. And so the relationship of the uprising land and the increasing depth of the sea comes and goes. And there are many places on the west coast of Scotland where you might have literally 15 beaches, post-glacial beaches, as that relationship has come and gone. And so I think I worked it out that I thought it was about, since I've been going to this bay for the last 30 years, I think it has gained about 3 inches. But I think the sea has probably also risen 3 inches as well. And anyway, who can say? I mean, no one's been measuring it. But it's I think in a way it's part of the Heraclitan thing, that Heraclitus says everything flows, everything is in state of either becoming or of declining, that there is no stasis, and that to conceive of the static and the fixed material leads one down incredibly false paths, and that only by understanding the systematic mutual shifting of things as they are will you understand anything at all. And that's why it's exciting to write about a tidal shore. A big tide, it's something like a kind of 14-foot tide, a vertical rise and fall there. And so to have that outside the door is like a kind of very explicit model of how everything is. And that's really another thing I think this book is about, that this isn't only about tidal pools, or isn't only about that bay. It's about how things are.
Are you in writing this book, did it quench some thirst you had about the subject, and do you put tide pools behind you? Obviously it's not just tide pools, it's everything, but I wondered if you still find yourself trotting around on the in the rock pools and putting plankton under microscopes.
I definitely do. I love taking people there and poking in. Poking in is just a really fun thing. And I have a little aquarium in the house, and bringing things back and keeping them for a few days in the aquarium and living with them. And it's I was always rather frightened by the idea previously of ecology, of not quite getting how systems worked in nature. I had always looked at individual creatures and things, but never, I'd always sort of been rather alarmed at getting to grips with how things work. And I think that I don't know if it's true of you, Nathaniel, but I write books to educate myself, really. It's just to sort of to tell how lovely the getting to know is the getting to know, and then it remains. And I now kind of see tidalism wherever I look.
I do too. I think that's one of the great gifts of this book. I mean, I do too. It's impossible not to see the world in these terms. I've just noticed where the questions are. Sorry. This is a question from Rebecca Henson. Hello, Adam. If only Rachel Carson were around today, you'd surely be close friends. Can you talk a bit about The Edge of the Sea and any influence her sea books may have had on you?
Do you know, I deliberately did not read The Edge of the Sea. I chose not to read that, and I still haven't. So obviously I know about her, and I know the terrible ways in which she was treated by the kind of corporate establishment after Silent Spring and so on, and the sort of awful cruelties that dealt out to her. And she is one of the heroes, isn't she? And yeah, if she hadn't written that book, someone else would have had to. So yeah, she's in there, although unknown.
You try to avoid as you're working on something any books that are too close, because I feel like writers go one of either two ways on that.
Yeah,
you could, yeah.
Otherwise, it's, I don't know why that is. How are you on that? Do you read everything you possibly can?
I admire writers who ignore anything that's close to it, but I can't help myself and obsessively read everything that's the closest thing that I can find to see, mainly to see if I can steal anything good, I suppose.
Yeah, quite stealing. I know there should be a whole book written on the stealing thing.
Right,
that is absolutely right. But you are an incredible researcher. What I've read of yours is just so founded. I'm so impressed by all of that. It is, you work like a demon to write these things.
Thank you. That's kind of you. Well,
it's true though,
I don't put myself in physical danger as you do out on the shoreline, but
no,
axes and so. Here's a question from Stephen. So much of Adam's work deals with the sea, and though this is a very big and maybe unanswerable question, I wonder if he can tell us a little about the origin of his fascination with the ocean.
Yes, no, I do love the sea, and I have written about it, and it all comes from some islands in the Hebrides. When my great grandmother died, she left my father some money, and he bought 3 very small islands in the Hebrides, which are incredible, wild, beautiful places with fantastic seabirds, 500,000 puffins and many others. And so I used to go there with him when I was a boy, and it always felt like I was being given access to the real world there, in a way, to the world as it could be if it wasn't diminished or constrained by all the boring things of everyday life. And so the sea, from when I was 8 or 9, I think, started to be a kind of touchstone of riches, of natural riches. And this book is undoubtedly due to that first apprehension, whatever it is, long time ago, 50 something years ago. And so no, I think the sea is certainly for us in the British Isles a kind of a fragment of the world in a relatively whole, not entirely, but relatively whole condition. So I think that's what it's about.
I think there's a kind of sea consciousness that one has. I think people who grow up near oceans and to some extent near bodies of water, I feel like it really shapes one's conception of the world in a profound way, and as any environment, I suppose shapes your view of the world. But there does seem to be a commonality of a sea consciousness. People in all parts of the world who grow up near oceans and coastlines, and I felt that very strongly in this book. There's maybe a natural inclination to look for these connections, or to see the world more in broader terms.
Well, also one of the things about a tidal shore is that twice a day, I mean, it shows you what it is in a very exciting way. That there's all this hidden life, and then curtains are pulled back, and there you are, and you're actually seeing almost like another planet there. And that's an invitation, isn't it? It's an invitation to engage rather than a sort of absolutely static relationship with what is. There's a very good Auden poem about how horrific it must be to live in a giant plain, in an enormous extended plain where there's not even any mountains. You can wonder what's happening the other side of them. And I think just the variability, this thing about the shore is that it's sort of reliable unreliability you get there, that there's motion and and revelation daily to hand. I mean, how you can't ask for anything more than that, can you, really, for me?
And it also, I mean, the book is also a really valuable reminder of the joys of close observation, because, you know, one can have these senses, you know, you see the ocean, you have some vague sense of you know, a wider world, but there's something really profound about the way that you write about just, you know, you have this section where you're just staring at the movement of the tide over the course of hours, and there's a beautiful drawing of the movement of the tide, and it's one of the things that I think great literature, and especially observational literature, can do, is it reminds you to look more closely. You know, it's a more vivid way of living, of being in the world, and I think that's one of the things that really moved me about this book, is it forces a reader to take stock in a more intimate way than one is used to in one's daily life. And so
That's lovely to hear you say that. Someone in England, Edmund de Waal, said a very nice thing about it. He said the book is both a call to arms and a call to pause. A call to pause is just, I treasure that phrase. I think that is exactly right. It is a call to stop organizing, be absorptive or absorbent. Yeah.
Do you feel any? Did you feel any pressure to write about? I mean, obviously, this larger ecological catastrophe that we're living amidst enters the book in various ways. But I was also impressed at the, I don't know, restraint that you used in writing it. It never becomes a you know, an activist type project or anything like that.
No.
And I wondered if that was something that ever was in your mind. Do you
Yeah,
have
no,
to?
it was a choice. It was obviously
Yeah.
a choice, and because there've been terrible destructions done to the sea in Scotland, as in virtually everywhere else, and I know about that. I wrote a book a few years ago about seabirds, and seabirds have declined by something like 1 billion birds in the last 50 years, and so I'm well familiar with it all. But I thought I wouldn't, because I don't know, why did I think not? I thought because, in a way, what Edmund de Waal said about this is right, that it's a call to arms, because it is a call to look, really, because only if people look will they care, really, and locally, and only if they care will anything change. And so you get in a pulpit and make the great statements, and it's very important that people do, but this could be I intended this really as a fuel for understanding. It is at a stage below the activist, that only if you know will you act. And so this is about getting in there and being there and knowing it and seeing it and feeling its value in itself, kind of beyond the political, or it's both pre-political and post-political. I don't know whether that is the right decision, actually.
I endorse it. No, I think it's so much more powerful. I mean, I think once you get into a polemic, it just saps the life out of a book like this, and I think that it's a much more profound engagement with these ideas, and I think one comes out of it with a much stronger emotional and personal involvement with the health of the oceans, of the coasts,
Well,
because you don't,
it's
make.
very encouraging you say that. I had a lovely email from a woman who lives not far from there, and she said that she used to go rock pooling with her children 40 years ago, and went with her grandchildren the other day, and in those bays, the same bays, and she could not believe the degree to which life was diminished from the way in which she'd known it when she was a young mother. And I thought maybe I might, if there is another edition or whatever, I might have that chapter with her at the end and go with her at the end. In other words, to make it very actual, as we were talking about at the beginning, and extremely specified with her, looking for the lovely nudibranchs. Do you have those there? Do you know lovely
They're on
sea
in
snails and
Northern
slugs?
California. Yeah,
Is it wonderful?
in Northern California, and I know, and I've spoken to citizen scientists there who they were rarely seen, and then one year there were so many of them that it was upsetting. It was almost like something was wrong,
Yeah.
bright red candy cane. Yeah.
Well, it would be symptomatic of some pollution event, that probably,
right.
To have a great surge of numbers of things. Anyway, no, I don't know quite what to make of this book. I don't know if you ever feel this about the books you write, but in some ways, I think it does do what it's meant to do, and in some ways, there's a sort of slight lack of focus in it, and it could have benefited from being more pointed and less discursive. I don't know.
No, I disagree. No, I think it's beautiful. And as we began the conversation, I think it's the discursive or the fluent quality of it, I think is exactly right for the subject. I mean, that's what you're writing about. It's consistent. The form, the structure, and the content are beautifully aligned. And I think it's actually rare to find that done so nicely. So I wouldn't touch it. I wouldn't
saw you referred to in one of your essays or articles about Also sprach Zarathustra. You don't you refer to that, and you know how marvelously that is written, which it doesn't have any discursion, if that's the word, discursiveness. It just goes but, and I think it'd be marvelous to write a book like that one day.
Well,
I might try that next time.
Next time. Well, thank you so much for this time, for this wonderful book, and it's just a beautiful continuation of all the work you've done in different subjects and themes. Are beautifully braided together here, and I urge everyone to seek it out, as well as all of the other books that you've contributed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm touched. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Adam, Nathaniel, for this wonderful conversation. If anyone wants to rewatch it immediately after we close out here, you'll be able to rewatch it here on the Crowdcast page or share it with everyone. I agree with what Steven said in the comments. I wish we could have been doing this around a tide pool in West Marin, but this was
one day.
One day. So thank you both so much, and have a great evening or day.
Thanks, Emily. Thank you.
Thank
Bye
you.
then.